The dog hit the fence so hard the chain link buckled inward, and every man in the yard took a single step back without thinking about it. Every man except her. Lena Whitfield stood 12 feet from the gate with a worn canvas field bag hanging off one shoulder and a clipboard tucked under her arm, and she didn't flinch, didn't widen her stance, didn't reach for the radio on her hip. She just watched the German shepherd named Kodiak slam himself against the fence a second time, watched the saliva fly, watched his eyes, and then she wrote something down. Sergeant Boyd Reese had been running K9 operations out of CFB Esquimalt for 11 years. He'd seen dogs go bad before. He knew what broken looked like, and Kodiak was broken. He'd put 2 handlers in the infirmary in the last 3 weeks, one with a dislocated shoulder, one with a bite to the forearm that needed 14 stitches. The evaluation request had come down from Major Del Vecchio himself, and Reese hadn't argued. He'd made the call that any experienced handler would make. Kodiak was done. What he hadn't expected was the evaluator they sent. "You're the assessment team," Reese said, walking toward her with his arms crossed. Lena Whitfield looked up from her clipboard. She was maybe 28, with dark hair pulled back at the base of her neck and a pair of mud-stained work boots that had seen more field time than most of the men standing around her. She had the kind of face that didn't give much away, not rude, not cold, just contained. "Dr. Lena Whitfield," she said, "Defense Research and Development Canada, Canine Behavioral Assessment DEC." Reese repeated, like the acronym tasted wrong. "They sent a researcher. They sent the person who built the behavioral protocol Kodiak was trained under." She glanced back at the fence. The dog was still pacing now, back and forth along the length of the run, his head low, his shoulders tight. "When was the last time he ate?" Reese blinked. "What? His last meal? When was it?" "I this morning. 0600, and before that." One of the other handlers, a younger guy named Corporal Tate, shifted his weight. "He's been refusing food on and off. Maybe 2 days back, full meal." Lena wrote something else down. Who was his primary handler before Sergeant Callum? The yard went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the wind off the inlet. "Callum's dead," Reese said, and his voice was flat because that was the only way to say it. 6 weeks ago. Training exercise outside Wainwright. Accident. Lena stopped writing. She looked at Reese, then at Corporal Tate, then back at the dog. "And in 6 weeks," she said slowly, "how many different handlers have you cycled through trying to get Kodiak to perform?" "Nobody answered. 4, Tate said finally quietly. "We tried 4. Lena set her clipboard against her thigh. She looked out at Kodiak, who had stopped pacing and was now sitting at the far end of his run, facing away from all of them. His back was rigid. His tail didn't move. "He's not broken," she said. "With respect, Doctor," Reese started, "that dog has put 2 people in the hospital." "I know. I read the incident reports on the flight from Ottawa." She looked at him with something that wasn't quite patience and wasn't quite impatience either. It was just clarity. "That dog is grieving. There's a difference, Sergeant." Reese laughed once, short and dry, the kind of laugh that meant he wasn't actually laughing. "We're not running a counseling center. We have operations. We have a deployment window in 7 weeks. If that animal can't perform, can I go in?" The question cut through cleanly. Reese stared at her. "The run." She nodded toward the gate. "I'd like to go inside." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a room of people all think the same thing at the same time, and none of them want to be the first to say it out loud. Corporal Tate looked at the ground. One of the other men scratched the back of his neck. Reese looked at the dog, a 100-pound Belgian-German cross with drive scores in the top 2% of any animal he'd ever worked with. And then he looked at this woman with her canvas bag and her clipboard and her boots. "You understand," he said carefully, "that Kodiak is not a pet. He is a combat-trained military working dog who has demonstrated unpredictable aggression toward." "I understand what he is," Lena said. "I'm asking if I can go in." Reese spread his hands. "It's your funeral, Doctor." He meant it as a deterrent. The expression on his face said so. The way he said it, flat, almost bored, like he was giving her one last off-ramp, made it clear that he expected her to take it. She handed him her clipboard. The gate opened with a metallic clang that echoed off the concrete walls of the training compound. The sound bounced out across the yard, over the heads of the 6 handlers who had gathered without anyone technically summoning them, and settled into the salt-heavy air that rolled in off the strait of Juan de Fuca. Lena Whitfield walked in alone. Kodiak didn't move. He stayed at the far end of the run with his back to her, and from behind the fence, Reese watched the dog's ears, tracking the sound of the gate closing, tracking her footsteps, tracking every shift of her weight in the gravel. The dog knew she was there. He just wasn't deciding what to do about it yet. She didn't walk toward him. She walked to the middle of the run, set her bag down in the dirt and sat. Not crouched, not kneeling, sat cross-legged, like she had nowhere else to be. "What the hell is she doing?" muttered one of the handlers behind Reese. Nobody answered, because nobody knew. Lena reached into her bag. She pulled out a small cloth pouch, the kind with a drawstring, worn at the edges the way things get when they've been handled for years. She set it on the ground in front of her. Then she waited. Kodiak's ears shifted, one rotation, then back. He still wasn't looking at her. A minute passed, maybe 2. Reese had seen inexperienced handlers try to wait out a difficult dog before. It usually ended one of 2 ways. The handler got impatient and pushed, or the dog got bored and aggressive. Either way, it ended with someone in a bad position. But something else was happening here, and Reese couldn't quite name it. Kodiak turned his head. Just slightly, not enough to look at her directly, just enough to take in her outline from the corner of his eye. She didn't react. He turned a little more. She reached into her pocket, slowly, deliberately, the kind of movement that announced itself before it happened, and pulled out something small. Reese squinted. It looked like a piece of rope, the same braided kind that working dogs used as tug toys. Old, frayed at one end, the color of a thing that had been played with until it stopped being a toy and became something else. She set it on top of the cloth pouch, and Kodiak turned around. He didn't charge, he didn't posture. He put his nose up, and he walked, with that careful, deliberate gait of a dog who is working something out, and he closed half the distance between them before he stopped. Reese realized he was holding his breath. Lena was speaking now so low that no one outside could hear the words, only the cadence of them. Low and even and unhurried. She wasn't looking at the dog directly. She was looking slightly past him, out toward the fence line, the way you look when you want to say something without making it an ultimatum. Kodiak took another step, then another. He stopped 2 feet in front of her. His nose was working. His eyes were fixed on the rope. "Boss," Tate said quietly beside Reese. Is that the same kind of tug Callum used to?" "Don't," Reese said. His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. In the run, Kodiak lowered his head. He sniffed the cloth pouch. Then he sat down directly in front of Lena Whitfield, and he leaned his considerable weight against her shoulder, and he stayed there. One of the handlers behind Reese made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Lena put one hand on the dog's side, not grabbing, not gripping, just resting. Her other hand stayed in her lap. She kept talking in that low, even voice, and Kodiak's breathing slowed. The tight, locked-up tension in his shoulders, the thing that had been there every time Reese looked at him for the past 6 weeks, eased. Just slightly, just enough to notice. Reese had been in this yard for 11 years. He'd never seen that dog choose to lean on anyone. She was inside for 40 minutes. When she came out, the men were still there. Not because anyone had ordered them to stay, but because none of them had quite managed to leave. She latched the gate behind her, picked up her bag, and walked back to where Reese was standing. He handed her the clipboard without speaking. "I'll need his training records from before Callum," she said. "Everything from the breeding program in Moose Jaw, his socialization notes, his drive assessments, his early obedience logs." Reese frowned. "Why?" because whoever placed him in Callum's unit didn't put the transition documentation in his file, and I need to understand the full behavioral history to write an accurate assessment. She paused. Also, whoever placed him didn't list his previous handler, the one before Callum. Reese went very still. What are you talking about? Callum was his primary handler from the beginning. He came out of the program at, Kodiak is 6 years old, Sergeant. She was looking at him with that same calm, direct quality. Not accusing, just factual. He's been operational for 3 years. Callum had him for 18 months. The math doesn't add up, and neither does the behavior. She tilted her head slightly. That dog recognized something in my bag, something specific. I need to know who taught him to recognize it. The question sat between them like a thing with weight. Reese looked past her at the run, where Kodiak had gone back to the middle of the enclosure. The dog was lying down now, still alert, still watchful, but lying down for the first time in 3 weeks, just lying down, like a dog who had remembered that rest was something that could exist. I'll have to make some calls, Reese said. I'd appreciate it. She wrote something on the clipboard. In the meantime, I want to recommend pulling the euthanasia request. Doctor, he's not a liability. He's a dog who lost his handler and has been handed to strangers for 6 weeks without any behavioral support or grief protocol. The fact that he only put 2 people in the hospital is actually a credit to his training. She met his eyes. Pull the request, Sergeant. Give me 72 hours. Reese stared at her for a long moment. Behind him he could feel the attention of every handler in the yard, all of them watching, all of them waiting to see how this landed. 72 hours, he said. She nodded and made another note. Thank you. She walked toward the admin building, and the yard went quiet in the particular way of men who had just seen something they didn't have a category for. Corporal Tate came to stand beside Reese, both of them watching her go. Sergeant Tate said quietly, that tug toy she had, I know, the rope toy. The one Callum always. I said I know, Tate. Silence. How did she have it? Tate asked. Reese didn't answer, because he was already wondering the same thing, and the answer that was starting to form in the back of his mind was too large to say out loud in the middle of a training yard on a Tuesday afternoon. The records took a day and a half to come through. Reese pulled them himself, called in a favor with a contact at the training directorate in Borden, and sat in his office that evening with a cup of cold coffee and the kind of file that shouldn't have been as thin as it was. The breeding and early socialization documentation was there, moose jaw program, registered dam and sire, standard protocol, all clean. The drive assessments were there, the obedience certification was there, the 18 months before Callum was not. Not missing in the sense of lost paperwork, missing in the sense of deliberately removed. There was a notation in the file, a single line, administrative shorthand, the kind of language that meant the information existed somewhere, but not here. Handler identity withheld per DND Directive 7741C. Contact Program Coordinator for access. Reese sat with that for a while. Then he picked up the phone and called Dr. Lena Whitfield's room at the base transit accommodations. She answered on the second ring. I found the notation, he said. Directed 7741C, a pause. I see. You already know what that directive is. It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. It's the confidentiality protocol for embedded civilian contractors in special operations, behavioral programs. Embedded civilian contractors, Reese repeated slowly, meaning people who work with operational K9 units but aren't listed in the standard chain of command. Yes, and you knew about this notation before I found it. A longer pause. I suspected. Reese leaned back in his chair. Outside his window, the lights of the base were coming on one by one against the grey Pacific evening. Dr. Whitfield, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I'd like you to answer me the same way. All right. Were you Kodiak's handler before Callum? The silence this time had a different texture. I was his primary attachment figure for the first 2.5 years of his life, she said. From the breeding program through early drive development, socialization, and initial obedience. I was the civilian researcher embedded in the program at the time. Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it. Something careful, the way a person is careful when they're choosing each word to be accurate. I wasn't listed as a handler because officially I was a researcher, but Kodiak doesn't make that distinction. No, Reese said. He doesn't. When they transitioned him to Callum, I was reassigned to the Ottawa office. The transition was supposed to be documented. The behavioral continuity notes, the rope toy protocol, the specific scent markers I'd used in early training were supposed to go into his file. She paused. They didn't. Reese set down his coffee. So for the past 6 weeks, while this dog has been rejecting every handler we've tried, while 2 men have been put in the hospital. He was looking for a scent he recognized, she said, a voice he knew, a protocol that made sense to him, a breath. I'm sorry, Sergeant. If the documentation had been there, you would have known to contact me immediately. This shouldn't have taken 6 weeks. Reese was quiet for a moment. He thought about Callum, who had been good with the dog. Not perfect, but good. The kind of handler who understood that patience wasn't a technique. It was a relationship. He thought about the 4 handlers who had tried, after, all of them doing everything right by the manual and getting bit for it. He thought about the euthanasia form that was still sitting in his outgoing tray, unsigned. The tug toy, he said. The rope you had in your bag. Callum gave it to me, she said quietly. After the transition, he said he didn't need it anymore because they'd moved to a different reward protocol. I kept it. I don't entirely know why. Because it was Kodiak's, Reese said. Yes, and when you came for the assessment, you brought it. I wasn't certain it would still mean anything to him. It had been 2 years. But dogs are. She stopped, and when she continued, her voice was more careful. Dogs encode emotional memory differently than humans do. The scent of that toy, combined with my voice, my movement pattern, it was enough. It gave him a reference point. Reese thought about the dog lying down in the middle of the run, just lying down. He'd been sitting vigil, he said. That's what it was. 6 weeks of not eating, attacking anyone who tried to replace what was gone. He was sitting vigil. A long quiet on the line. Yes, Lena Whitfield said. That's exactly what he was doing. The next 48 hours were different. Reese pulled the euthanasia request. He didn't make an announcement about it, didn't call a briefing. He just walked it to the admin office and took it back and put it in his desk drawer. The handlers knew. Word moved on a base, the way water moves, always finding the level. Dr. Whitfield worked with Kodiak in the mornings between 6 and 10, before the training yard got busy. She used the same low-register approach, sitting first, moving slow, letting the dog set the pace. Reese watched from a distance for the first 2 sessions, from the far end of the yard where he could observe without being observed. He wasn't checking up on her. He told himself that, and mostly believed it. By the second morning, Kodiak was taking food from her hand. Real food, not treats. His regular ration, the food he'd been refusing. He ate it out of her palm, with the focused, deliberate attention of a working dog who has remembered that his body is a tool worth maintaining. On the morning of the 3rd day, she introduced a new handler. She did it differently than anyone else had done it. She didn't step back and let the handler step forward. She stayed in the run, positioned herself between Kodiak and the gate, and she brought the handler in at an angle, body sideways, no direct approach, moving the way she'd coached him the evening before in the briefing room, with a whiteboard and a level of specificity that had clearly surprised him. His name was Sergeant Dale Firth, 7 years in K9, recently reassigned from the Edmonton garrison. He was good. Reese had checked. Kodiak watched Firth come in. The dog's ears went back, and Reese's hand went involuntarily to the fence rail. But then Lena said something. One word, clear and unhurried, and Kodiak's ears came forward. He didn't approach Firth, but he didn't retreat either. He looked at him, and then he looked at Lena, and she nodded once, like she was vouching for someone. like she was making an introduction between two people who didn't share a language yet and needed her to stand in the middle and translate. Firth extended one hand, palm down, and waited. It took 4 minutes. Reese timed it without meaning to. 4 minutes of Kodiak deciding whether the introduction was worth accepting, and then the dog walked forward with that same careful gait and put his nose to Firth's hand. One of the younger handlers, a woman named Corporal Osei Mensah, who had been watching from the gate, let out a slow breath. "That's the first time he's approached a new person voluntarily," she said quietly. "In 6 weeks." Reese didn't say anything. He was watching Lena Whitfield, who was still standing in the middle of the run, with her weight easy on both feet, watching Kodiak and Firth, with an expression that was something between focused and glad. Not triumphant, not performative, just quietly glad in the way of someone who has been working towards something difficult and has just seen it take its first real step. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Reese found her in the admin building hallway, field bag over her shoulder, paperwork tucked under her arm. She was heading toward the exit. "You're going back to Ottawa," he said. "Flight out of Victoria at 1800, she confirmed. He fell into step beside her. They walked down the hall without speaking for a moment, past the unit photos, past the framed commendations, past the board where the deployment roster was posted. "The assessment," he said. "What are you putting in it?" She tilted her head as if she was reviewing something in her mind. "Kodiak is operationally viable with appropriate transition support and an experienced primary handler. I'll recommend Sergeant Firth pending a 30-day bonding observation period. I'll also recommend that the behavioral continuity protocol be formalized going forward. Every military working dogs file should include the full handler history, not just the most recent posting." She paused. "And I'll recommend that when a handler dies, there is a grief protocol for the dog, a structured one with a timeline and defined benchmarks, not just rotating through people until something sticks." Reese was quiet. "That's a significant change to the program," he said. "I know. It'll push back against some of the operational culture. There are people who don't like the idea of applying the word grief to a working animal." She stopped walking. They were at the door now, the afternoon light coming in sideways through the narrow window above the exit, and she looked at him with that clear, direct quality that he'd been on the wrong side of several times now and had started reluctantly to respect. "Kodiak did 2 combat deployments," she said. "He found a buried IED in Kandahar that would have killed 4 soldiers. He tracked a missing child in the Gatineau Hills for 6 hours in November and found her alive." She held his gaze. "He earned the right to grieve. Dismissing that doesn't make the unit stronger. It just makes the unit less honest." Reese looked at her for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. She shook it. "Safe flight, Dr. Whitfield," he said. "Thank you for the 72 hours, she said. "And then the extra 24. He almost smiled. "Almost. Don't push it." She pushed open the door and walked out into the grey October afternoon. The kind of afternoon that comes off the Pacific with a salt bite to it, the kind that makes the mountains across the strait look like something painted rather than real. She crossed the lot without looking back, and the door swung closed behind her, and Reese stood there for a moment with his hand still out where she'd shaken it. Sergeant Dale Firth had Kodiak through his 30-day observation period without incident. The formal assessment came back from Ottawa marked approved. The deployment window was met. The grief protocol recommendation went into committee review, which in the military meant it would take somewhere between 6 months and forever, but it was there, on record, with documentation, with Lena Whitfield's name and credentials attached to it. In the training yard at CFB Esquimalt, on a morning in early December, Corporal Osei Mensah watched Sergeant Firth run Kodiak through a search pattern in the east quadrant. The dog moved clean and fast, tracking the scent cone the way he'd been trained, not hesitating, not second-guessing, working, the way a working dog works when the work makes sense to them. She made a note in her observation log. Subject demonstrating full operational capacity. Handler integration successful. No behavioral flags. Then she added, below the formal notation, in handwriting that wasn't part of the official report, "He runs like he's looking for something. Maybe he always will, but he runs." She closed the log, and across the yard, Kodiak cleared the search grid and turned back toward Firth, and his tail was moving.